In the summer of 1940, the United States Army was staring at a nightmare. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's armies were moving like a storm. Tanks, trucks, and motorized infantry struck with lightning speed. Entire nations, Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France, had fallen in weeks. The world watched in shock. And in Washington, America's generals were terrified. Because America was not ready. Not even close. Its army was a relic from the last war. Soldiers rode horses. Motorcycles were their fastest vehicles. Trucks existed, but they could barely survive off paved roads. If America were pulled into this war, its soldiers would face German tanks with nothing but mud, horses, and unreliable motorcycles. The problem was simple and terrifying. The U.S. Army had no way to move its men across battlefields. There was no vehicle that could climb mountains, cross rivers, handle mud, and survive under fire. Every test and exercise had ended in disaster. Men got stuck. Messengers failed. Entire units were slowed or trapped. The Army needed a miracle. And the Army demanded that miracle fast. On a hot summer day, the Quartermaster Corps sent an almost unbelievable request to 135 car manufacturers across the country. The Army needed a new kind of vehicle, a four-wheel drive car, light but strong, able to carry heavy loads, go anywhere, and survive the battlefield. And it had to be ready in just 49 days. It was impossible. Everyone knew it. Ford and Willis Overland, the giants of American car manufacturing, laughed at the idea. Designing a completely new car normally took 2 years, not 7 weeks. Engineers and executives called it madness. Some rejected it outright. Others politely asked for more time. But the Army would accept no excuses. The clock was ticking and failure was not an option. Yet, among the big companies who said no, there was one small, forgotten factory that said maybe. Bantam, a bankrupt car company in Butler, Pennsylvania, had been silent for months. Its factory floor was empty, its machines gathering dust, and its workers long gone. No one expected them to succeed. And yet, in desperation, its president, Frank Fenn, made a bold call. He contacted a freelance engineer in Detroit named Carl Probst. Probst was ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in skill. He was broke, unknown, and already 56 years old. At first he refused. He knew the job was impossible. He knew Bantam had no money. He knew the Army wanted the impossible. But Fenn insisted. This wasn't just a contract, he told Probst. This was a national emergency. Finally, Probst agreed, but with one condition. He would not take the job. He would simply offer advice. On July 19, 1940, Probst arrived in Butler. The factory was a ghost town, silent and empty. Only a skeleton crew remained, workers who had not built a car in months. Fenn laid the Army specs on the table. 2 days for the first blueprints. Probst looked at the numbers. 1,300 pounds maximum weight, four-wheel drive, capable of carrying heavy loads. He knew immediately it was impossible. The axles alone would weigh too much. The Army didn't know what it was asking for. This will fail, he told Fenn. He turned to leave, planning to drive back to Detroit. But he didn't. No one knows why he stayed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was patriotism. Maybe it was the look of desperation on the faces of the Bantam workers. For 5 straight days, Probst did something no one thought possible. He sat at a drafting table in the bankrupt factory and began designing the car from scratch. Every bolt, every bracket, every gear had to be imagined, guessed, and calculated. He worked without sleep, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that the world was burning. By the 5th day he had done the impossible. He had finished the blueprints for a revolutionary vehicle. A car that could survive battlefields, climb hills, cross rivers, and carry men and equipment. On paper it existed. In reality it had yet to be built. Meanwhile, across the country, generals and engineers shook their heads. They thought the request absurd. They expected failure. But in a silent factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, something extraordinary was happening. A bankrupt company, a handful of workers, and one ordinary man were about to challenge the impossible. The stakes could not have been higher. If Probst and Bantam failed, America's soldiers would remain trapped on motorcycles and horses. Entire units could be wiped out in the mud. The war might reach American shores with soldiers unprepared and under-equipped. And yet, against all odds, the first spark of hope had arrived. A blueprint drawn by a man who refused to surrender to impossibility. This was the beginning of the story of the car that would change the war. The car that would survive against all odds. The car that would become legend. Carl Probst was not a man used to miracles. At 56, he was broke, forgotten by the world of big engineering, and living in Detroit with nothing but his skills and his stubborn pride. When Bantam's president, Frank Fenn, first called him, Probst had refused. The deadline was insane, 49 days to design a car that no one else could even imagine. He had no team, no money, and no factory ready to build it. It was a death sentence for any engineer brave enough to try. But Fenn did not give up. He called again. "This is not just a contract," he said. "It's a national emergency. America is counting on us." Probst hesitated. He knew the stakes. He had read the reports from Europe. Hitler's blitzkrieg had turned entire nations into ruins, armies annihilated in weeks. If the United States entered the war unprepared, its soldiers would face machine guns, tanks, and mud with only horses and motorcycles. The casualties would be unimaginable. Finally, Probst agreed to go to Butler, but only to advise. He would not take the job. He would sit quietly, look at the specifications, and leave. On July 19, 1940, he arrived at the Bantam factory. The building was silent. Machines lay idle, gathering dust. Only a skeleton crew remained, workers who had not touched a car in months. The room smelled of rust, oil, and old ambition. Fenn laid the Army's blueprints and specifications on the table. 2 days for the first drafts. The Army demanded a vehicle that weighed less than 1,300 pounds, could carry 600 pounds of equipment, and traverse any terrain. Probst studied the numbers. His mind raced. He ran calculations. He knew immediately it was impossible. The axles alone would weigh more than the limit. The frame, engine, and drivetrain, all would exceed the requirements. "This will fail," he told Fenn, his voice calm but firm. He turned to leave, already imagining the drive back to Detroit and the comfort of saying no. But something stayed his hand. No one knows exactly why Probst stayed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the desperate hope in Fenn's eyes. Maybe it was the silent plea of the workers, a handful of men staring at him as if he were their last chance. Against all reason, he sat down at a drafting table. At first, he intended to sketch ideas just to help the company. But then the impossible challenge consumed him. Every bolt, every gear, every bracket, every wheelbase had to be imagined, designed, and accounted for. There were no parts ready. He had to guess weights, stress limits, and dimensions. He was not just an engineer, he became a mechanic, a mathematician, and a dreamer all at once. He worked through the nights, fueled only by coffee and sheer determination. The Bantam crew watched in awe as he scribbled calculations, erased them, and scribbled again. Sleep did not exist for him. The factory became a stage for obsession. Each day the pressure increased. The Army would accept no excuses. Soldiers' lives hung in the balance. On the 5th day, something extraordinary happened. Probst leaned back, exhausted, his eyes red from staring at blueprints for 120 hours straight. On the table lay the complete design for a vehicle that could do what the Army demanded. On paper, it was a miracle. A 4-wheel-drive car, light yet strong, capable of carrying men and supplies anywhere, climbing hills, crossing rivers, and surviving battlefields. The room was silent. Even the skeptical Bantam workers felt the impossible had been achieved. But the blueprints were only theory. They had not yet built a single car. The Army wanted results, not drawings. There were 44 days left to turn paper into a functioning war machine. Probst knew the truth. Designing the car was only half the battle. The other half, building it, was even more impossible. Bantam's factory was meant for small civilian cars. It was bankrupt. Its machines were old. Its workforce limited. Supplies were almost non-existent. And yet, the fate of America's Army now rested in the hands of this ordinary engineer and a handful of desperate men. Meanwhile, back in Washington, generals and big manufacturers continued to shake their heads. Ford had already walked away. Willis Overland had asked for extensions they knew they couldn't meet. No one thought Bantam could succeed. The world expected failure. But in a quiet factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, Karl Probst had said yes. He had accepted the impossible. And for the first time, a spark of hope flickered in the darkness of despair. Against time, against logic, against every expectation, Probst had taken the first step toward a miracle. The race had begun. The clock was ticking. America's soldiers were counting on a car that did not yet exist. And one ordinary man had just become the last, desperate hope for victory. The Bantam factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, was a place where hope had gone to die. Machines sat idle. Workers had been laid off months before. The smell of rust and oil filled the empty halls. And yet, on July 19, 1940, a single man began a task no one thought possible. His name was Karl Probst. He was 56, broke, and unknown to the world of big engineering, but in those hands lay the fate of an army. The Army's specifications were a list of impossibilities. The car had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds, carry 600 pounds of equipment, go anywhere and survive every kind of terrain. The deadline was insane, 49 days. Engineers at Ford and Willis had laughed, called it madness and walked away. Yet here was Probst sitting at a drafting table, staring at the blueprints, knowing that failure meant death for soldiers in the field. At first, Probst intended only to advise. But the more he studied the numbers, the more he realized that no one else would do it. The Army was serious. The clock was ticking. Every hour lost could mean American lives in the mud, stuck and defenseless against German tanks. He could leave, but he didn't. Something stayed him, pride, patriotism, or the desperate eyes of the Bantam crew. It did not matter. He decided to take the impossible challenge into his own hands. For the next 5 straight days, Probst worked without pause. He barely slept. Coffee became his lifeblood. He became everything at once: engineer, designer, mechanic, and accountant. Every part of the car had to be imagined from scratch. Every bolt, bracket, gear, and axle had to be calculated without real parts to test. He guessed weights, dimensions, and tolerances. There were no manuals, no instructions, no safety nets. Probst's work was a dance with madness. On one side he faced impossible numbers. On the other he had the Army's unyielding deadline. He scribbled, erased, recalculated, and sketched again. He imagined the car climbing hills, fording rivers, plowing through mud, and carrying soldiers and equipment. He calculated every spring, every wheelbase, every frame. The factory echoed with silence, broken only by the scratching of pencil on paper. The Bantam workers watched in awe. Some had not built a car in months. Others had given up hope entirely. But Probst's obsession was contagious. The air was thick with tension. If he failed, there would be no prototype. No chance. Soldiers would continue to die in exercises. And yet, every hour, the impossible began to take shape on paper. By the 5th day, exhaustion had taken its toll. Probst's eyes were bloodshot. His hands were stiff from endless calculations. And yet, there on the drafting table, lay the complete blueprints for what would become the Bantam reconnaissance car. On paper, it was revolutionary. Light, strong, 4-wheel drive, able to carry men and equipment, cross rivers, climb hills, and survive battlefields. But blueprints were only theory. No bolts were yet turned. No engines mounted. No wheels tested. The real challenge lay ahead: building the car. Bantam's factory was designed for tiny civilian cars, not rugged military machines. Supplies were scarce. The workforce was skeleton at best. Parts had to be improvised. Axles were scavenged from old Studebaker cars. Frames had to be hand-formed. Every weld was critical. Every miscalculation could destroy the prototype, and with it, America's hope. Probst knew that the Army would accept no excuses. Soldiers' lives were at stake. The clock was ticking and 44 days remained to build a working vehicle from nothing. It was chaos waiting to happen. The factory floor became a theater of improvisation. Probst was not just a designer. He was the foreman, the quality inspector, and the chief problem solver. And still the suspense hung heavy in the air. Would a bankrupt company with a skeleton crew actually produce a working car? Could one ordinary engineer beat time, physics, and logistics all at once? Every hour brought tension. Every misaligned part increased stakes. The fate of the U.S. Army, and potentially the course of the war, rested on a fragile line of hand-drawn blueprints and the genius of Karl Probst. By the end of that 5th day, a miracle existed on paper. A blueprint for a car that should not have existed. A design that broke every rule, defied every expectation, and challenged every conventional engineering principle. And somewhere deep in Butler, Pennsylvania, in a silent, bankrupt factory, hope had returned. The real race, the race against reality, was about to begin. The blueprint was done, but building it was a whole new battle. The blueprints were done. The miracle existed on paper. But in the real world, paper does not win wars. The real challenge was only beginning: building a car that could survive battlefields in 44 days, in a bankrupt factory with a skeleton crew. Bantam's factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, had never seen a challenge like this. Every machine, every tool, and every worker had to be pushed beyond limits. Failure meant America's soldiers would still be trapped on motorcycles and horses, facing German tanks with nothing. Karl Probst did not hesitate. He became more than an engineer, he became the heartbeat of the factory. He was the foreman, the mechanic, the quality inspector, the problem solver. Every part had to be checked, modified, or improvised. The axles were too heavy, the frame too weak, the suspension untested. There were no spare parts, no factory plans for such a vehicle. Everything had to be created on the fly. Probst called suppliers frantically. He begged for parts, sometimes taking what was available and making it work. A Studebaker transmission? Modify it. Axles from a standard car? Reinforce them. Springs too soft? Bend them. Every solution was temporary, risky, and untested. But there was no choice. The Army's 49-day deadline did not allow for perfection. Only survival. The factory lights burned 24 hours a day. Welders, mechanics, and sheet metal workers returned, many having been laid off months earlier. Tool belts clanged. Sparks flew. The sound of hammers, welding torches, and engines being tested echoed through the halls. For the first time in months, Bantam was alive, a hive of desperate energy. Probst slept on the floor near the assembly line, waking to check measurements, adjust brackets, and solve new problems. The car slowly began to take shape. The frame was welded by hand, the engine mounted, the wheels fitted. Every day brought new challenges. Misaligned parts threatened the schedule. Improvised tools broke. Workers made mistakes in exhaustion. Each hour was a test of endurance, skill, and luck. The tension reached its peak on September 21st. Only 48 hours remained. The Army's delivery site, Camp Hollard in Baltimore, was 250 miles away. The car was mostly assembled but not fully tested. The engine ran but the wiring harness was incomplete. The axles were reinforced but not ideal. And the custom transfer case from Spicer Manufacturing had arrived, but the mounting brackets didn't fit. Probst and Harold Christ, the factory manager, faced the impossible. They had to drive an untested, handmade, prototype car 250 miles through public roads to deliver it on time. Failure anywhere along the route would doom the project. The car might break down, the axles could snap, or the engine could fail. Every mile carried the weight of America's hope. On the morning of September 22nd, Probst climbed into the driver's seat. Christ sat beside him. The paint was still wet, the welds fresh. They started the engine. It hummed softly, a fragile heartbeat in a car born of desperation. The road ahead was long and there was no margin for error. As they drove, the car protested. Every bump rattled the frame. Every turn tested the steering. Yet, inch by inch, the miracle car moved forward. People on the roadside stopped and stared at the strange little vehicle. Small, square, almost ugly, but it carried something much larger, the future of the U.S. Army. Then just outside Harrisburg, disaster struck. A loud clank came from the front axle. The steering wheel jerked violently. The car veered across the road and slammed into a ditch. Probst's heart sank. The universal joint in the steering linkage had failed, a simple 50-cent part. They had no spare. Silence fell. Darkness surrounded them. For a moment, it seemed the impossible had failed at the last hurdle. But Probst was no ordinary man. He grabbed a welding torch from the back, lay on his back in the mud, and welded the joint solid. The fix was crude. The car could barely turn left. But it could move. It had to. Covered in mud and grease, Probst and Christ climbed back in. The car limped the remaining miles. Every vibration, every rattle was a threat. Every mile was a gamble. But the miracle held together. Slowly, painfully, the car approached Camp Hollard. The deadline was close, 4:30 p.m. on September 23rd, but the prototype, battered, muddy, and barely functional, arrived just in time. At the gate, the Army officers waited. So did engineers from Ford and Willis Overland, the giants who had called the project impossible. They had come to watch a small bankrupt company fail. But now, before their eyes, a miracle had happened. The impossible car had arrived, alive. It was ugly, small, and covered in mud, but it moved. And in that moment, the impossible began to feel real. The Bantam prototype had beaten time, physics, and human expectation. America's hope had arrived on 4 wheels. The race against time was over. The real test, the Army's evaluation, was about to begin. And the world was about to see that one ordinary engineer, one bankrupt company, and one desperate prototype could defy every expectation and change history. The Bantam prototype, battered, muddy, and barely functional, rolled into Camp Hollard with only minutes to spare. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the parade ground. Army officers, engineers from Ford and Willis Overland, and a handful of reporters watched silently. The giants of American manufacturing had come to witness a failure. They had laughed at the 49-day deadline, certain a bankrupt company could not deliver. Now that certainty was about to shatter. Karl Probst climbed down from the driver's seat, covered in grease and mud. Beside him, Harold Christ looked exhausted but relieved. The officers approached, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the strange little car. It was small, boxy, and ugly, almost comical, but it was alive. And that alone was a miracle. The first test was simple but terrifying: a weigh-in. The Army had demanded the car weigh no more than 2,300 pounds. Probst knew the car was overweight. The heavy-duty axles, reinforced frame, and improvised parts had added weight. When the officers placed it on the scale, the numbers confirmed his fear: 2,300 pounds exactly, maybe a bit over. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Ford executives smirked. Disqualified, one whispered. But the Army officer in charge ignored the corporate giants. He stepped forward and said simply, "Start the engine." Probst turned the key. The engine roared to life. For the first time, the car moved under its own power in front of its judges. The test was brutal. Mud pits, steep hills, river fords, heavy loads. The Army's engineers tried to break it. Trucks had failed here. Motorcycles had failed. Soldiers had been trapped, delayed, and even killed during exercises because no vehicle could survive these obstacles. The Bantam car did the impossible. It crawled through the mud, climbed hills, carried heavy weights, and emerged on the other side. The engineers' jaws dropped. The prototype, a hand-built miracle, had survived every test designed to destroy it. The Ford and Willis men stopped smiling. The impossible was now real. But triumph came with bitterness. The Army needed thousands of these vehicles, not just one. Bantam, a bankrupt company with a skeleton crew, could only build a handful at a time. The Army could not wait. America's soldiers needed this car in mass production immediately. And so the Army did something that felt like betrayal. They thanked Karl Probst and the Bantam team for their heroism and patriotism. And then, almost immediately, they took the blueprints, the designs Probst had drawn for free, the designs Bantam had built in blood, sweat, and desperate nights, and handed them to Ford and Willis Overland. The two giants who had laughed at the 49-day deadline would now mass-produce the car. Bantam had proven the concept, but the Army needed industrial power. It was a crushing blow. The ordinary men of Bantam, who had risked everything and created the impossible, were sidelined. Their miracle car would live on, but under the names of other companies. Probst stood silently, exhausted and angry, but he could do nothing. The Army needed the cars to save lives, and there was no time for pride. Yet, despite the betrayal, the prototype had won. It had proven the car could exist, that the U.S. Army could finally have a vehicle capable of surviving battlefields, mud, rivers, and hills. The engineers from Ford and Willis studied every detail. They tore apart the design, analyzed the suspension, the axles, the weight distribution, and the drive system. They admired it secretly, though they would never admit it publicly. Bantam received a token contract. A small number of their cars would be built as a thank you. But the war was too urgent for nostalgia or justice. The Army had chosen efficiency over loyalty. Ford and Willis would produce hundreds of thousands. The Bantam team, ordinary men with extraordinary courage, had been the unsung heroes of the greatest military innovation of the war. The prototype, now dubbed the BRC-40, became the template. Its design elements, lightweight frame, four-wheel drive, rugged suspension, were copied, improved, and eventually formed the basis of the Willis MB and Ford GPW, vehicles that would carry soldiers across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Every mile, every river crossing, every hill climb that American GIs accomplished was made possible by the work of Karl Probst and Bantam. In a quiet corner of Butler, Pennsylvania, the factory returned to silence once more. Machines cooled. Workers left exhausted. The story of their sacrifice, their 49-day miracle, was mostly unknown outside the Army's walls. And yet, the tiny, ugly car they built would change the course of history. It would carry medics to the wounded, soldiers to the front, and supplies across impossible terrain. The triumph of the Bantam prototype was real, but the betrayal was sharp. One ordinary engineer had created a miracle, but the system ensured that the glory went to the giants. Probst had saved lives, proven the impossible could be done, and yet, his name would not be the one remembered by history. Still, as the sun set over Camp Hollard and the first Bantam car rolled onto the parade ground, a new hope had been born. America now had the weapon it needed, a car that could go anywhere, survive anything, and carry the Army to victory. And it had all begun with a desperate engineer saying yes when the world said no. The race was far from over. The war was raging, the Army needed more cars, and the story of the Bantam miracle was only halfway told. But one thing was certain: the impossible had been achieved. And the tiny, ugly car that no one believed in would become legend. The triumph of the Bantam prototype was undeniable. It had survived the Army's brutal tests, proving that a light four-wheel drive vehicle could go anywhere, climb anything, and carry men and equipment. But triumph on the parade ground was not the end, it was only the beginning. The U.S. Army now faced a bigger problem. They needed thousands of these cars and Bantam could not deliver. The Army made a decision that would forever change the story. They took the blueprints Karl Probst had drawn in a desperate factory in Butler and handed them to Ford and Willis Overland, the industrial giants who had laughed at the 49-day challenge. Bantam had built the proof of concept. Ford and Willis would build the war machines. The engineers at Willis immediately began designing a more powerful engine. The Bantam prototype was strong and light, but it lacked the horsepower needed for combat conditions. Willis introduced the Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower beast that could pull heavy loads, climb steep hills, and survive the toughest terrain. Ford, meanwhile, focused on the body and production. They refined the design to make it easier and faster to mass-produce, creating the iconic flat-slotted grille that would become the face of the Jeep for generations. What emerged was a Frankenstein vehicle, combining the genius of Bantam's lightweight frame, Willis' powerful engine, and Ford's efficient production design. No single company could take full credit. The car was a collaboration born of desperation, ingenuity, and wartime urgency. And yet it worked. Miraculously it worked. By early 1941, the Army had 3 prototypes ready for testing. Bantam's original BRC-40, Willis Go Devil-powered prototype, and Ford's refined version. The Army arranged a final, brutal competition at Camp Hollard. It was not just a race, it was a battle for the soul of the U.S. Army's mechanized forces. The tests were unforgiving. Vehicles were driven through deep mud, climbed steep gravel hills, forded rivers, carried heavy loads, and endured rough terrain designed to break them. The Bantam BRC-40 was light and agile, able to maneuver where others got stuck. Ford's Pygmy was smooth and efficient but lacked the power to climb heavy hills. Willis' Quad had raw strength, climbing hills and carrying loads easily, but was heavy and harder to handle. The Army's technical committee faced a dilemma. Each car had strengths and flaws. Bantam's design had proven the concept, but the engine was weak. Willis had the best engine but the car was too heavy. Ford had perfected the body for production but lacked agility. The war in Europe was intensifying. Hitler's armies were advancing. Time was critical. There was no room for debate, no time to redesign. So the Army did something extraordinary. They combined the best elements of all 3 vehicles into a single machine. Bantam's lightweight frame, Willis' powerful Go Devil engine, and Ford's efficient production body were merged. The result was a new vehicle, the Willis MB. A car that could be mass-produced, survive any terrain, carry soldiers, weapons and supplies, and change the face of warfare. The first mass-produced Jeeps rolled off the assembly lines in 1941. Soldiers across the U.S. Army could hardly believe it. A small, ugly, and unassuming car had become the most versatile weapon in their arsenal. Its speed, reliability, and adaptability meant that soldiers could carry out missions previously impossible. Reconnaissance, supply delivery, troop transport, and battlefield rescue, the Jeep did it all. The Jeep's influence was immediate. In North Africa, British SAS commandos mounted machine guns on Jeeps, creating fast attack vehicles that terrorized German supply lines. In Russia, the Red Army soldiers called it the Ivan Willis, relying on it to pull artillery through frozen mud. During D-Day, it was the first vehicle to drive off the Higgins boats onto Normandy beaches, carrying commanders, medics, and supplies, paving the way for tanks and trucks. Yet, for Karl Probst and the Bantam team, the triumph was bittersweet. Their designs had saved the Army, changed the war, and created a legend. But history would not remember their names as the builders of the Jeep. They had done the impossible only to see the industrial giants take the credit. Still, Probst had no regrets. His car was everywhere, saving lives and winning battles. The ultimate goal had been achieved. The U.S. Army had a vehicle that could go anywhere, survive anything, and turn the tide of war. The Jeep was more than a car. It was a symbol of ingenuity, determination, and resilience. It represented the idea that even ordinary men in desperate situations could create something extraordinary. And it proved that in war, innovation often comes not from wealth or power, but from courage, desperation, and brilliance under pressure. The world had never seen a vehicle like it. And for every soldier who climbed into a Jeep, crossed impossible terrain, or carried a wounded comrade to safety, the spirit of a single engineer from a bankrupt factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, lived on. The Jeep was born. And with it, the ordinary men of Bantam had left an extraordinary mark on history. The war raged on, and the Jeep became more than just a car. It became a lifeline. Across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, soldiers depended on it for every mission. Its small, boxy frame belied its incredible strength. It carried wounded men through mud and snow, transported ammunition across treacherous terrain, and became a mobile command center for officers leading attacks. It was everywhere, unseen and uncelebrated by the world, yet indispensable. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, the Jeep's true value became clear. German tanks surrounded American soldiers, cutting off supply lines. Horses and trucks were useless in the icy mud. Only the Jeep could maneuver through the frozen chaos. Soldiers piled in, ammunition stacked high, medics transporting the wounded. The little car, born from desperation and genius, saved hundreds of lives that would have otherwise been lost. In North Africa, the British SAS mounted machine guns on jeeps, creating fast, deadly attack vehicles. These flying jeeps could drive hundreds of miles around enemy positions, strike airfields and supply lines, and vanish into the desert before German panzers could respond. The jeep had evolved from a utility vehicle into a new kind of weapon, transforming modern warfare. In Russia, Soviet soldiers called it the Ivan Willis. It became a symbol of hope and reliability. Supplies were delivered to front lines frozen under snow. Artillery was moved through roads that had become impassable for ordinary vehicles. The Jeep did not just survive, it thrived, giving soldiers mobility and confidence they had never experienced before. Even during the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, the Jeep led the way. Higgins boats carried tanks, trucks, and soldiers to the beaches of Normandy, but the first vehicles to touch the sand were Jeeps. They carried commanders, medics, and supplies, moving faster and farther than any truck. Tanks followed, but it was the Jeep that kept the Army coordinated, agile, and alive. Every successful landing, every forward push into Europe, depended on the little car that had come from a bankrupt factory in Pennsylvania. Despite its enormous impact, the origins of the Jeep were bittersweet. Bantam, the tiny company that had built the first prototype, was largely forgotten. Karl Probst, the engineer who had designed the miracle vehicle in just 5 days, did not receive the credit he deserved. The Army had handed the design to Willis and Ford for mass production. Bantam received only a small consolation contract to build trailers. Yet Probst and his team had no regrets. Their creation had changed the course of the war. Their car was everywhere, saving lives and proving that ingenuity could outmatch industry giants. The Jeep's legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. Its design influenced every off-road vehicle that came after it. It became a symbol of reliability, ingenuity, and resilience. Soldiers, journalists, and civilians alike remembered it as the workhorse of the war, the car that could go anywhere, survive anything, and accomplish the impossible. American generals, including Dwight D. Eisenhower, called it one of the 3 tools that helped win the war, alongside the C-47 transport plane and the bazooka. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, wrote that it was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. Every soldier who climbed into a Jeep felt that reliability. Every mission that succeeded because of its speed and versatility added to its legend. After the war, the Jeep's story continued. Millions of vehicles were built, not just for the military but for civilians around the world. Its design evolved, but its spirit remained the same: resilient, adaptable, and unstoppable. The little car that had been built in desperation, in a dark factory under a 49-day deadline, became a symbol of human ingenuity, determination, and courage. The men of Bantam faded into history, but their miracle lived on. Every Jeep on the battlefield, every soldier saved, every mission accomplished was a testament to their courage and brilliance. The story of the Jeep is not just the story of a vehicle. It is the story of ordinary men achieving the extraordinary, of defying impossible odds, and of leaving a mark on history that would never be erased. From the muddy fields of Louisiana maneuvers to the beaches of Normandy, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of Europe, the Jeep proved itself over and over. It was a machine born of desperation, shaped by genius, and forged in the fires of war. And though the names of its creators were mostly forgotten, their legacy endures every time a Jeep climbs a hill, crosses a river, or carries a soldier safely to the other side. The Jeep had become more than a vehicle. It had become a legend.